All right, let's go ahead and get started today. A couple things to keep in mind. If you still have some work to complete, make sure to have that in by tomorrow. You can still get credit for it. And then don't forget as well, midterm on Monday. I believe it is 10 o'clock, but I need to double check. If it's not 10 o'clock, I'll email everybody. So a little bit earlier than usual. Similar format in some parts, but the study guide is available on Blackboard. So I'll be looking over that and ask me if you have any questions. Either stop by my office or shoot me an email as we work through it. There's some things I want to do for a review today to help you prepare for the final. Specifically wanting to focus on some of the essay things instead of taking the time to go through all the terms, but I would encourage you to spend some time on those terms for the short answer and the multiple choice. If you have any questions about what I'm looking for, or you can't find something in your notes, feel free to get in contact with me about that. I will be around the rest of this week and certainly available by email over the weekend. So most of what I wanted to focus on today is thinking about the essays. So the midterm will have a similar part, or excuse me, the final will have a similar part to the midterm, in that the first section will be short answer, multiple choice, based on that list of terms solely from the midterm on. And so you don't have to know material from the first half for the multiple choice or the short answer. Instead, just focus on those terms. But there also will be a shorter essay, and by shorter essay I'm talking about 7 to 10 sentences would be sufficient. You don't have a huge essay that you need to write for the first section. So that I want to spend some time talking over, helping you get some ideas of some things to focus on. If you remember on the study guide, there are 4 potential topics in the essays, very similar to the 4 potential topics for the midterm, only it will be about the 19th century and the 20th century instead of the earlier material. So there is the potential of an essay on politics, an essay on culture and society, essay on doctrine, an essay on practice. And so in each of those, you'll be asked to describe one element from the 19th century, one from the 20th century. And so I want to kind of bring together some of the things we've talked about to help you think about what to write for those essays and the potential for writing for those essays. So, in thinking about 19th century politics, you would only need to talk about, the question would be asked in such a way where you would only need to talk about one example from the 19th century. But there are essentially 3 aspects that we talked about. And so choose one of these 3, know it really well, have an idea what it's about, who's involved in it. And so if one of the questions is politics and you want to write about politics, you know exactly what you want to talk about. So the 3 that we talked about, the first was the Taiping Rebellion. Now, this one was in China, and also dealt with, the movement kind of associated with it was referred to as the Heavenly Kingdom. So you'd want to talk about the Heavenly Kingdom. You'd want to talk about, that it's kind of a mixture of Christianity and elements from traditional Chinese religion. Kind of the institution of the 10 Commandments as part of the guiding of society. And so that would be the general direction if you wanted to talk about that. Another thing you could talk about with the 19th century in politics would be slavery and the Civil War. Right? So again, you would only have to talk about one of these. But whichever one you choose, you would want to make sure that you would describe it in detail. right? And so again, 7 to 10 sentences, but you would want to take 3 or 4 sentences to talk about the 19th century, 3 or 4 sentences to talk about the 20th century. Always a good idea to try and include specifics as much as possible. Right? Specific people or specific events. That demonstrates to me you know what you're talking about. Right? And so whatever you can demonstrate, if you absolutely have no idea, write something general. You'll probably get some partial credit if you're in the, Now, if you're saying the Civil War, you start talking about slavery in the Civil War and you're talking about Greenland, right, you're probably not going to be getting credit. But, some general things, there was a Civil War and it was the North against the South. So the more specific you could be, the better. But at least for the essays, try and get something down so that you can get at least some partial credit. And so for slavery and the Civil War, in the political section, you'd be wanting to focus on specifically political aspects. So you wouldn't be talking about necessarily the arguments for slavery, but you might be talking about how Christians used religious arguments for secession, how the Civil War was viewed as a religious war. There's Christians on both sides of it. Those are the kind of things that you would want to say some things about. And then the third option would be to talk about manifest destiny. Manifest destiny that this 19th century movement across the North American continent, believing that it was the will of God for Anglo-Saxons to extend across the continent, but also some of the impact that had on Native Americans. And so you could talk about reservations, you could talk about the Indian schools, right? And so any one of those three would be a possible thing to talk about in the 19th century. Right? And so I would suggest take one of those three, go back through your notes, go back through Gonzalez, and really get down one of those three so that you're ready for that question if it's about politics. But those are the main three we talked about in class. Certainly if you remember something from Gonzalez that you thought was interesting about 19th century politics, you're welcome to talk about that. But as far as like getting down, those three, one of those three would be a good idea. So that would be your 19th century component. The 20th century component, there are 4 potential things that you could talk about if the essay was on politics. So, for example, talking about the Russian Revolution, and maybe even talking about the fall of the Soviet Union. Either one of those, or combined together, would be fine. And so you'd probably talk about the gradual marginalization of the Russian Orthodox Church after the Communist Revolution, how Russians essentially had to practice their Christianity in secret. And then on the other hand, after the fall of the Soviet Union, talking about how important Christianity was for a moral renewal in the country of Russia, as people kind of found a lot of corruption, and after the Soviet Union's fall, Christianity kind of became, Christian churches kind of became a resource for the Russian government to try and bring some morality back to the people. Another potential topic you could write about would be World War II. All sorts of things you could say with World War II. You could talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We've talked about him. Christianity in the Holocaust. We briefly talked about, we talked about the post-war revival in the United States, this increase of people interested in Christianity. Another option might be the the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the attempts by the communist Chinese government to decrease participation in Christianity, and so requiring people to register with one of 2 groups, whether they were Protestants or Catholics. the attempt to eliminate Christianity from China, but how Chinese Christians went into the house churches, worshipped in secret, and have expanded quite greatly. And then the fourth option would be to talk about the Christian right or the evangelical left, and how evangelicals became very active in politics in the last part of the 20th century. You can talk about both, you can talk about just one, but here too, in all three of these, you would want to make think about it this way. You're on an elevator, and somebody on the elevator asks what you know about the Chinese Cultural Revolution and Christianity. Right? And so you have like 20 seconds before the elevator gets where it needs to go. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for you to say. What are the most important things to highlight? Just a brief overview, get any important people, ideas, but not something you're writing pages and pages and pages about, which you could on any of these topics. But just a brief description giving the major ideas. And so I would say as you prepare for the final and think about the essays, pick one from the first list of 19th century politics, pick one from this list, and just have them down really well. And just focus on those two topics. I think that would be the best way to help you prepare for that essay. Any questions about that? We'll go through, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. I'm going to go through each of the culture and society like this and give you some bullet points to think about, maybe help you focus a little bit. And so, hopefully this will be helpful as you prepare for that essay. And so the second possible essay is culture and society. And so a couple things in the 19th century, a couple things in the 20th. Certainly in the 19th century, there's a lot you could say about slavery. Again, just try to come up with just a couple sentences. In fact, if you want to write out an essay response, you kind of saw what I asked on the midterm, and that's pretty much going to be the same, right? And essentially, you're going to talk about one from the 19th, one from the 20th. And so if you want to write out a paragraph and say, if I wrote this for a question on culture and society, would that be good? If you wanted to say that and send it to me as an email or stop by my office with it on a printout, by all means do that. I'd be willing to look over it and say, that's great. Have that down, you're okay. Or, you might want to include this idea, you might want to include that idea. And so abolitionism, you want to be able to talk about some people. What is it that's motivating them in a Christian mindset? How is abolitionism influenced by Christianity? Those kind of things. And another possible topic you could talk about with culture and society would be the benevolent empire. Right? That network of organizations that was devoted to Christianity having a practical effect on the world. So missionary societies, Bible societies, Sunday school societies, wanting to see reform in prisons, people's use of alcohol, those kind of things, the benevolent empire. In some respects, if you know some things in the terms, and if you have those down in the terms, the essay should be fairly easy for you to do because you're just writing it out instead of being able to look at a multiple choice question, for example. Another aspect of culture and society you could write about with respect to the 19th century would be immigration. Variety of routes you could go with this. You can talk about the influx of Catholics into the United States, the kind of things that brought Catholics, the response of Protestants to Catholics. You could talk about the kind of nativist response and this kind of Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxon race, and so we're kind of wanting to see the promotion of the Anglo-Saxon race. That might be another route to go as well. The fourth major element would be to talk about modernism. What kind of impact is modern life and some of the things with modernism having on Christianity? And there's kind of two routes you could go with that. You could either talk about the Catholic response, things like quanta cura in the syllabus of errors, this opposition of the Pope to certain things about secularism, naturalism, this kind of opposition to some of the philosophical developments of the 19th century. On the other hand, you could certainly talk about the Protestant response and talk about liberal Protestantism. Click at me. Liberal Protestantism, what liberal Protestantism was, how it was an attempt to adapt Christianity to things like Darwinism, some other elements of modern life, scientific developments, those kind of things. And in fact, one of the slides in the notes talks about like the themes, right? Adaptation of Christianity to modern culture, the immanence of God in human society, the optimism and spread of the kingdom of God. Right? So being able to say something about that would be good. In the 20th century, there's so many things you could talk about as well, but here are a couple that you might want to focus on. You could focus on issues of social justice. This might be a good pair to the benevolent empire. So in the 19th century, you talk about the benevolent empire. In the 20th century, you talk about the social gospel or Catholic action. Right? And so Christians, attempting to respond to social issues during their times. Another option, of course, would be civil rights. You could compare, or you could pair abolitionism with civil rights. Right? So there's this kind of abolitionist dream, but it's not fully fulfilled. And then we have civil rights and what all was behind that. Talk about Martin Luther King. Some of the opposition to the civil rights movement from Christians, others using Christianity to advance civil rights. Something to pair with immigration might be the topic of pluralism. We talked about pluralism, the increase of immigrants, particularly from Asia, in the 20th century, how that led to some Supreme Court cases, or was connected with some Supreme Court cases, and how there was very much an opposition in the 20th and 19th century to immigration. In the 20th century, that had more of a profound effect, as Christians maybe mixed and matched some Christian elements with some Eastern religions like Hinduism or Buddhism. So that might be a route that you could go. Kind of compare, bring two things together that have some similarity. Might be a way to help you think of composing a cohesive essay. But you wouldn't necessarily have to do that. You don't necessarily have to make a connection between the 19th century and the 20th century. For example, environmentalism. I don't know what necessarily you connect that to from the 19th century. Maybe something about modern life. But in 20th century, that would be another thing you could talk about with culture and society. This kind of original opposition to Christianity as being responsible for the environmental crisis, and then other Christians trying to respond to that. And the fifth thing we talked about during our look at culture and society in the 20th century was televangelism. And so that might be an option as well. Any questions? Anything of those?
On these essays, are we supposed to also put our opinions on them, or?
Not so much this essay.
Okay.
The comprehensive essay, they'll have some places where you can kind of add your opinion into or kind of evaluate some of these things. If you did that, I wouldn't have a problem with it. Right? But it's not something you absolutely have to do. Any other questions? Doctrine, same kind of thing. There's 4 or 5 that you can pick from. Restorationism. Certainly you'd want to talk about, we talked about the different trends, Scottish common sense interpretation, anti-elitism, desire for unity. So you want to go back through your notes or through the slides and through the videos, and look at those, have those down. Talking about the Campbells, maybe even Barton Stones, those would be good things to think about for that. Another option with doctrine would be to talk about William Miller and his attempt to use scriptures from the Bible to calculate the date of Jesus' return. So you wouldn't necessarily have to go through how Miller, we talked about how Miller went about and got that calculation. You wouldn't have to do that. If you can do that, that's great. But you wouldn't have to, and you would still do well in the essay. But just kind of being able to say, William Miller used biblical passages, attempt to determine when the return of Christ would be. It didn't happen. Right? Yes, it's probably understood that I know that you know that it didn't happen, but putting that down might be a good thing to include. And some of the aftermath. That would be a pretty good response there. Instead, you could talk about the rise of higher criticism, the quest for the historical Jesus, this liberal theology that becomes very critical of the Bible's composition, historicity of the Bible, an attempt to make the Bible or approach the Bible in a scientific way, or what's thought of as a scientific way, with the assumption that certain elements, the supernatural elements of the Bible, for higher critics, people searching for the historical Jesus, they're assuming the supernatural elements could not be true. So this kind of scientific skepticism. The fourth option would be to talk about the Immaculate Conception or papal infallibility, or both. It would also be very, very good to know for maybe, let's say, possibly a multiple choice question, that the Immaculate Conception refers to Mary, not to Jesus. I think that would be very good to know for a multiple choice question, that the Immaculate Conception refers to Mary, not to Jesus. There might possibly be a question about that on the final. But being able to talk about the Immaculate Conception, the ideas of it really becomes supported because of this supposed Marian apparition and this vision of Mary. That might also be a good multiple choice question. That it's a vision of Marian or a Marian apparition that helps lead to the support of the Immaculate Conception. On the other hand, papal infallibility, you'd want to talk about that it's very limited. Right? The Pope is not infallible for Catholics at all times. It's only when he's speaking of matters of universal church teaching. And so it's very specific. But a doctrine that develops in the 19th century, not really a doctrine that existed before that point to any significant extent. There's a couple places when we think about the 20th century where you might be able to make some parallels. That's always a good thing in essays like this. Again, it's not required. You could just pick one and it'd be completely unrelated to the other one. But if you can kind of combine them and make some parallels, that really looks good, like you know the material. So if you can think about those kind of things, that would be good. So thinking about the 20th century fundamentalism, you could pair that with restorationism. Right? Fundamentalists thinking about themselves going back to the fundamentals of the faith. You could pair that with the Millerites. Not so much because fundamentalists tried to determine the date, but one aspect of fundamentalism was that dispensational premillennialism. Right? So it had a view of how history progressed and things related to the end of time. And so pairing between one of those in the 19th and fundamentalism in the 20th might be a route to go. Neo-orthodoxy might be another doctrine to talk about. Maybe pairing that with higher criticism, quest for the historical Jesus. Right? Neo-orthodoxy coming out of that liberal Protestantism, but trying to kind of pull back from how human it was. And really wanted to re-emphasize some things about sin, about the transcendence of God. And so that might be a good pairing. You might pair the Immaculate Conception or papal infallibility with the Second Vatican Council. I mean, that would work pretty well. Papal infallibility developing as a doctrine out of the First Vatican Council. That too might be a good multiple choice question. Asking which council papal infallibility came up in. And that's the First Vatican Council. So that would be a good pair with the Second Vatican Council. With the Second Vatican Council, we talked about a bunch of different things. And so just a general overview. Right? It's a worldwide council looking to modernize the church and dealt with a broad range of issues related to Catholicism. If you could say something about John the 23rd, that's great. If you can give a specific example like changing worship styles, or you can talk like a brief thing about birth control, that's even better. But just a brief overview of it being a worldwide council, modernization of the church. And so that would even be another good multiple choice question, the purpose of Vatican II being the modernization of the church. A final option you could talk about with the 20th century in doctrine would be the contextual theologies. You wouldn't have to talk about them as a group, but you could talk about liberation theology or black theology, feminist theology. Attempting to adapt or have the Christian message speak to specific ethnicities or specific political realities. For liberation theology or black theology or issues of gender. Any questions about any of these to clarify maybe what they are or so practice, a couple things you could talk about there. The Second Great Awakening. Again, we talked a lot. We talked about the different regions. We talked about different people. But in general, like an increase of emotional connections to Christianity, a revival of religious adherence, Another aspect you could talk about would be the music. You could talk about spirituals, gospel hymns, just kind of briefly giving some characteristics of what those were and how they were new and different. You could talk about new forms of Christianity. There's a couple of routes you could go with this. You could talk about just in general, right? In the 19th century, there are new forms of Christianity, and list some examples and just generally talk about them. Or you could talk about specific groups, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Shakers. Either route would be fine. And then a fourth aspect would be to talk about missions in the 19th century. You could talk about Russian Orthodox missions that we spent some time on in class, or you could go back to Gonzalez, and he spends quite a bit, and there's a chapter in there where he talks about William Carey, he talks about some other missionaries and the spread of missions in the 19th century. Here too, finding some parallels would be good when it turns to the 20th century. So you could talk about new forms of Christianity. In the 19th century, you could talk about Pentecostalism in the 20th. And yes, there's quite a bit of difference between Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Pentecostals, right? But as far as like a unifying theme of, Pentecostalism develops in the 20th century. So you can kind of make that kind of comparison. Again, remember, snake handling is not the norm in Pentecostalism, right? Whichever route you go there, don't make it sound like it's the norm. You can talk about the fundamentalist subculture. A parallel might be with the Second Great Awakening. There's an increase in Christian adherence, but fundamentalism retreats because they feel like America is moving away from Christianity. Wasn't necessarily completely accurate, but the feeling that fundamentalists had was of one of losing their influence. Or you could kind of connect the Second Great Awakening with the Jesus movement, the Jesus people. You could connect the music of the 19th century with contemporary Christian music in the 20th. Talk about these new styles in these specific times. And then finally, we spent some time talking about some changing conceptions of children, some changing practices related to children, like children's worship or children's media. So remember, for each of those four, right, that's going to be the second, or it'll end up being the third part. First part will be short answer. Second part will be multiple choice. Third part will be this briefer essay, and you'll get your choice of two. So just for each of those, prepare for one in the 19th, one in the 20th. As I said before, it does not have to be one of these, but if you focus on one of these from each of those two time periods, you'll be in good shape. Any last questions about that briefer essay? All right, let's talk then about the comprehensive essays. I'm going to talk about the first one and the last one because in some respect the second one is very similar, and so I think if we talk about the kind of things I'd be looking for in either the first one or the third one, I think you'll be prepared if there's one based off of the second one. Additionally, if you think about it, there's going to be two and you're going to get to choose one. You might also then determine why I'm focusing on 1 and 3. And so you might be able to figure that out as to what is going to appear on the font. The first question is going to ask you about trends. In this question, as well as the third question, or the third topic on the study guide, in both of those, you are going to get your opportunity to choose what it is you want to talk about. So I'm going to give you an example. You can use this one. You can go a different route. Right? But this hopefully will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. For both of these essays, the goal here is to get you to talk about the entirety of the class, so from the Reformation to the present. It is a comprehensive essay. It is going to be worth about 1/3 of the final total, the total of the final exam. And so you want to be able to say as many specifics as you can. And so, like I said here, you can use the one we're going to talk about if it gives you an idea. I mean, if you have an idea already and you've been working on something, fine. That's great. But this might help you pick out something, and then you can really focus on some ideas. And so the one I'm giving you as an example here would be trends in the issue of church and state. You could talk about trends in worship. You can talk about trends in doctrine. You can talk about trends in, we'll talk about for the second example here, race. Right? So there's all sorts of things you can talk about here. But this would be an example of what I would expect you to do if it was church and state. So that might end up, I might get 11 or 13 examples of an essay on church and state, and then 4 more from the online class. That's fine, right? If everybody writes on church and state, that's fine, as long as you're doing your own work during the exam period. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what I'm looking for. And so you'd want to talk across the time periods we've examined. So the first thing you would want to talk about in this essay would be to talk about the Reformers' views. What was the Reformers' views on church and state? So go back to that early section and look up, the Anabaptists, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli. The more specific that you can get, the better. But at least talking about some reformers believed that there should be an alliance between church and state. Some believed that, and so just kind of going down, and the Anabaptists, for example, believed that church and state should be totally separate. The more specific you can be, great. But if you have to do one of those, some said this, some said that, some said this. If you have to do that, that's fine. You're not going to necessarily lose any points, but it looks much better to me reading your essay. All right, you exactly pointed out what the Anabaptists believe. And so if you can be really specific, that's better. So talking about the Reformers' views. What were their views? Right? Some supported church and state being united in different ways. So looking back over that. And so the Reformation period. In the 17th century, there are a couple of directions you could go. You might not have the time to talk about all of these, but having a couple of these would be a good idea. And, talking about things like the phrase "cuius regio eius religio," which essentially was the religion of the prince of a region is the religion of the region, right? And so if you have a Catholic prince, that religion was considered a Catholic country. There's a Protestant prince, Protestant country. So you could say, here we're seeing this even though there's a Reformation going on and Christianity splitting, there's still this unity between church and state. Same kind of thing with the English monarchs. You wouldn't have to go through and say, Henry VIII was Protestant, and Edward VI was Protestant, and Mary I was Catholic, and Elizabeth. You wouldn't have to do that, right? But talking about the impact that those monarchs' religions had, and the shifts. Sometimes they were this, sometimes they were that, but it was still this unity of church and state. You might talk about the Puritans and their views on church and state and how that impacted the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Gallicanism in France, and how the French were, with the Gallican French, were trying to separate themselves from papal control, right? They wanted to be more distinct, have more control over bishops and priests in France. You could talk about Locke and Milton and how their ideologies, their philosophies, provided the foundation for a lot of Western views on separation of church and state. So for the 17th century, picking one, two of these that you could describe in some pretty significant detail would be the way to go. As you move into the 18th century, talking about the Enlightenment view on Christianity, the First Amendment, those would be good things to talk about there. Unless you're going to really talk a lot about the First Amendment, you'd probably want to talk about both in this case. Right? There's a lot to say in the 17th century, so just pick a couple, but having something to say about both. Again, not a lot. You don't have to write, a page or something on the Enlightenment and another page on the First Amendment, but being able to say something significant. Again, remember you're tying it into your trend. Right? So how does this relate to church and state? If we get into the 19th century, here too you can go a variety of ways, but you could talk about the revolutions in Latin America and how there's this kind of, with these revolutions, getting rid of these imperial powers, there's also this concern about how much control the Pope has and how the church is involved in government. You can talk about the increase in secularization in Western countries as more and more of them are moving away from church and state. You could bring in the consequences of the French Revolution, the consequences of the American Revolution, and how that's working itself out. And as we get to the 20th century, you could talk about court cases related to school prayer, Bible reading, pluralism, right? The increase of immigration, other court cases. We talked about some other court cases. The Scopes trial might be one you could bring in. And so, if you wrote this essay and you wrote on church and state, that's basically how I want you to progress. Right? Progress through the different periods, providing information about each period that we've covered. In some rather significant detail so I get the understanding you know what you're talking about. And as I said, you can choose something different than church and state. If you do, that's fine. But just kind of, what's that view in the Reformation period? What's the 17th century, 18th century? Those are the kind of things that you would want to think about. If you find yourself missing a period, you might want to consider a different trend, right? Because it may not be that much of a trend. But go back through again. If you don't want to use this one, which is fine, go back through your notes and say, okay, we hit this issue through each of these time periods. Maybe that would be a good one to write about. The focus of this essay will be largely historical. You can inject your evaluation if you would like, about whether you think it's a good thing, the trajectory of the separation of church and state. But the other question, the third question, the third topic on the study guide, really will ask you not only to provide a historical overview, but an evaluation as well. So you definitely want to be thinking about that for that particular topic. Here too, the question is going to be written in such a way that you have your option for how you want to talk about it. But essentially, picking a topic or an idea of some behavior or theology that you've seen throughout this time period throughout the class, talking about what it was and then evaluating it. So, the example I'm going to use here is Christianity and race. Here too, you can pick this one, you can choose something else. And remember, you're only going to be writing one essay. And so, take that into consideration about how you prepare for this section. So, in the analyzing part of this, you would want to have something similar in that historical overview. Right? How has this issue changed, modified? How do we see it expressed in various time periods across the course? And so in the early period, you could be talking about the missionary strategies, the conceptions and treatment of Native Americans by missionaries, by imperial powers. Thinking about how some missionaries were more positive towards Native Americans, some were more negative, some allowed them to keep their culture, others forced them into European culture. The debate over do Native Americans have souls or not. A lot of that tied up with race, this racial difference, and trying to make some decisions and understanding there. Then you can move on into a discussion of the enslavement of Africans, that conversion to Christianity that takes place among the slave population, the ways in which a lot of the Christianity for a lot of slaves was a hybrid of their traditional indigenous African religions with the new Christianities, as well as that question of what happens if slaves are baptized. So you could talk about things in the 17th century, all sorts of things related to that issue. 17th century, 18th century. In the 19th century, you can talk about kind of the dichotomous way in which Christianity was incorporated into this racial issue. How on the one side, it provided African Americans who were enslaved the power to continue through, to make sense of their situation, to escape their situation in some cases, to reincorporate some ideas that they were given by white Christians, reinterpret them into new styles of Christianity, like the spirituals, the invisible institution, how Christianity often empowered those individuals who rose up against the white masters and other things within that society. On the flip side, talking about how Christianity is being used by slave masters, others in the South, to justify the holding of people in bondage. You want to talk about, some are saying, well, look at these passages that support slavery. Slaves obey your masters. Here you have Abraham and others holding slaves. There's no condemnation of slavery in Scripture. Those are the kind of things that the Christians used to justify slavery. On the flip side, talking about abolitionism, many Christians motivated in the North and in England to end slavery. Or you could return back to Native Americans and talk about the rise of the reservations, some other things related to that as well. And then you would probably cap off such an essay with a discussion of civil rights and the Christianity that's involved in civil rights on both sides, those supporting civil rights, those against the civil rights movement. But in this case, you would be asked to do some evaluation. The Christianity you see here, is this, in your view, is this fulfilling the Christian mission? Is this working counter to Christianity? Even though people are claiming, justification from the Bible or other types of things. And so more specifically, evaluating the claims and practices that we see throughout Christian history. And certainly in your evaluation, you would want to include kind of a basis for it. Just saying, as a Christian, I think slavery is bad. Well, I would agree with you. But what are you using to evaluate that judgment? What specific passages, general principles from Christianity? What is it that serves as the basis for your evaluation about this issue, about another issue? And so that would be something that would be a component of more that type of question. Anything to clarify or explain further in either of these two examples? All right, well, that's all that I have. I'm willing to stick around if there's other questions, or as I said before, I'm reachable by email, be on campus. If something comes up, by all means, get in contact with me. Let me know what I can do to help you. Once we get to 10 o'clock on Monday, though, that's all I can do. So if you need something or you need some help or want to talk about some ideas, by all means, get in contact with me. If not, I will see you on Monday.